Well, good morning, everybody. Wish I was there in person, but I guess we'll just have to live with another virtual presentation. Special thanks to the organizing committee for inviting us to give a presentation with the assigned title, Limits and Challenges of Wheat Production in a Changing Climate. To that end, I invited some colleagues that I've met over the years as chair of the expert working group for agronomy. They include James Hunt out of Australia, Patricio Grassini, University of Nebraska, John Kirkgard, who needs no introduction, out of Cicero in Australia, and last but not least, Romulo Lovato out of Kansas State University. Um, so really, when I was asked to give this talk, I think it's a real obviously topical um, issue, and so I sort of thought about, yeah, we have the challenges of climate change, and so what are the limits to our yield, and finally, what are some opportunities around trying to adapt to climate change, and then, of course, you know, ahead is all about heat and drought, and water is a big driver of and constraint of yield, and so is nitrogen. So I thought I would touch and comment quickly on those within my time here. And if we start with the challenge, obviously I don't have to be Captain Obvious about what global warming's doing. And I like to put it in the context of what Sentold Assange did with his study here. And there I am speaking to you today from Lethbridge, Alberta. And so this was yield that was modeled from 81 to 2010 and what the annual gains were. I would say we're a little bit better than what we've been assigned. We're around, I would say, just under 2% per year combined agronomic and genetic advancements. But as the climate begins to and temperature increases, then we start getting some issues. We're still not too bad up there in Canada, but certain parts of the world are turning bright red in terms of losses in yield potential. I think that's the real thing to not lose out on is both the impact of climate change and also the policies. They can't limit our yield production. And so, when we speak about climate action, up here in Canada, the federal government came up with what was called the Guelph Statement because it was prepared in Guelph, Ontario. Initially, it was a little more aggressive, I think, in its phrasing and wording, reduced fertilizer use, but then it sort of evolved, I think, to become more about being more efficient, getting those levels down to emissions that were experienced in 1990. So that'd be about a 33% reduction. And of course, Europe being a little more aggressive with their Green Deal Farm to Fork initiative. The issue, though, is that if you want to cut fertilizer use, you're going to impact yield. And so even this impact assessment, if I read it right, talks about best case scenario, there aren't going to be any yield gains, but you could have up to 50% reductions in production with this kind of policy implemented. So that's a concern for me as an agronomist, particularly in the context where you already have an alert out there that there's a very real threat of not maintaining but declining rates of yield growth even before policy comes into play like that. And so it's more important than ever, I think, that we talk about not individual technologies, but the importance of taking those, which obviously are critical, and building them into a genotype by environment by management system. And this is some work that we've done through the Wheat Initiative. And we actually developed an actual research strategy that we hope our policymakers will take and use. Because some of the policy I'm seeing right now just seems to collide and not really reconcile with some of the issues. So it's more important than ever that we use sound science and evidence for both advances in innovating, but also in policy making. So those are some of the challenges. What about the limits? Well, I think the limit could be sort of drawn in the context of what are our yield gaps. And what is a yield gap? Well, a yield gap is that gap that you see when you take what would be the yield potential of what we're saying would be 80% of a modeled potential that would be based on local conditions, but also the genetic potential of the variety being used, and how close we get in achieving that on farm with this average yield. So if our yield is here, then the exploitable yield gap is there. And it doesn't make any sense to get beyond the 80% because it would just be cost prohibitive in most environments. And so Patricio and his group have mapped out yield gaps for all kinds of crops around the globe. This is wheat. Here you guys are 63% yield gap. That's a pretty stark and critical yield gap that needs to be closed going forward. And it has to be done in the face of a changing climate. So that's a big time challenge, and that's a big time limit if we don't do our research right. And then we just finished mapping Canada and the USA as well. And so we don't have obviously the yield potential of areas like South America and Europe, but not too bad. Quite a range though, from 1.5 to maybe pushing closer to nine-ish. Yield gaps are sort of all over the map a little bit as well, almost as low as 50% in some areas, but as high as 60 to 70 up here in Canada. Now there's some outdated practices here, so that yield gap down here in some ways doesn't surprise me. Globally, we have a yield gap of 50%. So to me, I look at that as less of a challenge and more of an opportunity. I think that gives us a great chance to close down some of these yield gaps if we can focus in on the right priorities needed in that particular region using an approach like a G by M theme. The practice or the actual innovation might change, but the principles used to achieve it would always fall under and complement the G by E by M approach. And we have to do this, don't forget, people, on existing cropland that each year is declining through all sorts of issues or causes. But one bright spot is best summarized, I think, in this great slide by John Kirkgard, based on a paper that him and James Hunt published, and good example of what happens in isolation when you use outdated practices. So I'm thinking of that yield gap, for example, in parts of the USA where it's not anywhere near where it should be, in my opinion. Outdated practices in isolation versus updated practices woven together in a way that is synergistic, plus combined with genetics that are needed for the challenges of that particular region. This Greg Rebetsky in your audience could give you all sorts of information on this long coleoptile, which is a really innovative solution to what's going on in Australia right now. And then I think that leads into some experiences where myself and James Hunt have gone with really looking at shifting the critical growth period to try and get it out of that period where abiotic stress, heat and drought is really intense in the prairies or in Australia. And Australia, to be honest, is worse off than Canada. They don't really talk about, I don't think, too much in yield gains because they're just trying to maintain what they have. Back to what Fisher said earlier, and then some of these papers here, stall and wheat yields attributed to climate and so on. And so James has looked at getting away from traditional spring wheat and planting dates and moving more into experimenting with changing crop phenology, genetics that have different phenological traits in terms of duration of the vegetative period and so on, or switching a spring wheat growth habit with a winter wheat growth habit and so on to see if they can take advantage of that limited water that they have. And so here's an example of some of the work that they've done on, experimenting with different cycles, fast wheats versus slow wheats, and so on. And what they've learned is that by going earlier, they're producing more grain. And by going later, which is probably more conventional, there's a yield drag and a penalty associated with it. And just some more evidence here on how they've optimized it. Bonnie Floor and her group of authors here. I like this title and what they've came up with. Fast winter wheat phenology stabilizes flowering date and can maximize grain yield, and so on. So a lot of good work down there in response to a changing climate around water. Why was I thinking about this? Well, I was thinking about it more in terms of opportunity on the prairies, where in March I could see conditions on the farm that we could probably go plant. So why wouldn't we? And partially why we wouldn't is because just sort of, you know, conventional wisdom at the time and practices. And for example, this region here, crop insurance dates, the cutoff for that is May 10th. And so I think there's this idea that adhering to a calendar date, as long as you planted by May 10th, there was nothing wrong with that. But my idea here was, let's get away from calendar dates and move to using a prescriptive practice of soil temperatures to trigger the time when you would go plant. And so instead of May, we were hitting times as early as in February here. So that's a pretty disruptive practice and recommendation to what was going on. And here's another example. We went as early as February in this one, and you know, it's not like we had poor conditions for planting. We had really good conditions. And part of the reason for that is that we've had actually, you know, an extension of our frost-free period. And that's just simply a fact. And so why not take advantage of it? But the concern is, well, you know, the plants would experience snow, frost, freezing after that, and so they would perish because of it. And that simply hasn't been proven the case. What has been proven, though, is that by shifting our critical growth period out of sort of, you know, this time of early July, when we start to experience temperatures well above 30 degrees at times, which if you're still up here in conventional planting with your critical growth period in red here, it's really detrimental to your to floret development, which affects seed number, which is the number one driver for yield, and it'll shorten your critical growth period. So you just get hammered by abiotic stress if you're a bit late and if you're in that time period. And we've shown the same thing. Like if you wait, you suffer a yield drag. And if you have practices, in this case, a lower planting density than a higher one, it's a double whammy. So back to John's point there of integrating these new practices so that you get some synergistic effects, and farmers appreciate it. They've gone out and adopted this, not just in southern Alberta where the temperatures and conditions can be a lot more amenable, but up in central Alberta here, this fellow here, Matt Gold, he planted. It snowed after. He was a bit worried, but it ended up being the best wheat crop he's ever had. And we have many stories like that. Okay, so shifting gears now to, what does the nitrogen conundrum present around the challenges of climate change? And is there opportunity to mitigate and meet some of those targets around reduced greenhouse gas emissions? But I think an honest conversation, though, needs to take place about the contribution of ag to these things. Like if we look at the top emitters, for example, here's your countries that are emitting lots of CO2. Big wheat producers aren't way up at the forefront here necessarily. Now you have China as a greenhouse gas emissions leader, way above everybody else. Canada, we're not even on this bar graph, we're so low. And then within the context of Canada, again, agriculture is only contributing 10% of the emissions when you break it down by sector. So I think we need to be real and honest with the impact we're going to make. And if we get too aggressive and tie the hands of producers and industry too much with agriculture, it could really backfire with no appreciable impact anyway. And that's not to say we shouldn't be doing it, though. Like I'm extremely supportive and embrace this idea of putting a target around reducing greenhouse gases. In our case, we want to go back to levels of 1990, I think that's a great idea. And I think we can innovate and provide ways of getting there. And we have low end use efficiency, particularly in the first year. That means we can suffer significant end losses as a consequence. But we can't just talk about solutions around reduced nitrogen, because a reminder here, you know, higher yield potential probably requires more nitrogen requirements, and the opposite will affect negatively production. And so we have to be cognizant of that. So here's an example of a G by E by M approach where we've combined varieties with some of these alternative end sources, with application methods to try and improve agronomic responses. But more importantly, in the context of this conversation, did we actually mitigate greenhouse gas fluxes? And the interesting thing is, by simply adopting an enhanced efficiency fertilizer, a nitrification inhibitor, or a dual nitrification urease inhibitor, we actually achieve in one practice change that reduction of 33% greenhouse gas emissions. And this isn't just an observation we've made, this is something we've seen in other studies as well. So with just one simple practice, you can achieve that. So I think there's opportunity out there right now to start meeting some of these. And so, sorry for the cluttered slide, but basically my point here is that fertilizer is costly. Adding an input cost associated with enhanced efficiency fertilizer, one would say it can't be done and a farm still be profitable. And I think my argument here is I think we can, because we've got some yield potential across the prairies. We're improving our yields by adopting these enhanced efficiency fertilizers, usually, not always. But if we stack it with other practices that are improving and or stabilizing yield, now we could be in a situation where we both meet some of these policy targets around climate change, but still remain profitable. And that's the win-win, I think, if done right. We could be providing value in the range of $162 per hectare and meeting some of these other things around social costs of GHGs as well. So I'm positive and optimistic that there's solutions out there. And what I'd like you to do is keep that in your mind when you go out to your evening in lovely Morocco, and maybe think about it a little bit and raise a toast to your fellow agronomist, because like Hugh Jackman says here, it's not for the faint-hearted. So with that, I'll thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of the workshop.